Thank you so much for joining us on the second walkthrough of the Fashioning Illinois exhibition. Tonight we are in the section that we call What to Wear. And this section explores the different clothing options that women had in the 19th century, tied to different stages of life, different occasions. So as we go through this portion of the exhibition, we're just going to be highlighting some of the different occasions on which women would wear different clothing. So we're going to dive into the dresses now, and the first one I want to talk to you about is this ball gown. This was worn by a Waverly, Illinois woman named Noni Wemple, and this dates to right around 1900, and it's this silk ball gown. She's got this distinctive pigeon shape to her physique that became popular right around the turn of the 20th century. You can see her, she's got this mono bosom right here, so one kind of bust area, and then in the back she has sort of her, she's got a bum roll to kind of accentuate her backside, which was meant to give her kind of a S-shaped silhouette. And this dress is just flat out stunning, which is why I was so happy to be able to get it on exhibit and let people look at it. I also wanted to start here because this is often what we think about when we think about a 19th century fashion exhibition, are the beautiful dresses. And of course, people do want to see beautiful clothes. But I start with this not only because it's gorgeous, but also because it's not representative. And the things that wind up in a museum's collections tend to be skewed by self-selection. So picture, you know, how many million people were on Earth in the year 1900, all of them wearing clothes. Of those people and their clothing, only a tiny, tiny small fraction of that survives today. Most of it was used up, recycled, discarded, what have you. The things that do survive and make their way into the museum tend to be things that someone saved because they were beautiful and because they were expensive. And tend to be from people who were more affluent, who could afford to first own a dress like this in the first place, and also to put it away and not give it to someone else or recycle it or find another use for it when they didn't want it anymore. So that means in our collections we've just got a picture that's a little bit off when you come to think about the everyday clothing of the majority of women, which is why we've put this beautiful lavender ball gown right next to another outfit that also dates from around the turn of the century, around 1900. And this is actually more characteristic of what an every woman type would wear. This is a blouse and skirt combo. It's a shirtwaist blouse, which was kind of a new innovation by the end of the 19th century, and a separate skirt. And so you can imagine how freeing it was for a woman to have separates in her wardrobe. Before, all dresses were ensembles. You would have a matching bodice and skirt that functioned together as one look. Here you could, you know, have your skirt and you could switch it out with a fresh blouse every day. This is also an ensemble a lot easier to put on, easier to wear and to care for. And this reflects growing freedom of movement in women's clothing in the 19th century. So the shirtwaist blouse is often considered sort of a symbol of women's liberation, because this is the type of thing that women would be wearing into the workforce. And at the end of the 19th century, you have women who are going to work in offices and in factories and in retail establishments in much greater numbers than ever before. So these working women are kind of driving this change in women's fashion to something that is easier to wear and care for. And so these blouses, which were modeled after a man's shirt, kind of became, you know, the unofficial uniform of a working woman. So on the one hand, there's symbolizing women's greater independence. On the flip side, these blouses were also made by women in the garment industry, and they're often working in factory conditions or sweatshop conditions that are less than optimal. They're working long hours in unsafe conditions for little pay. And so at the same time that these blouses can be seen as a symbol of women's liberation, the flip side is the symbol of the exploitation of women's labor that was used to mass produce clothing. So on that theme of everyday garments, we're going to move here to two work dresses. And while the ball gown was beautiful and is beautiful, as a historian, these dresses are more exciting to me because of the way they speak to the everyday nature of women's lives and women's work. And so that ball gown symbolizes the feminine ideal of the 19th century, a woman who is beautiful and done and graceful and refined and, let's face it, sort of ornamental. And this was the ideal to which women were to aspire, but the reality then was no different than the reality today. And women in the audience listening today, how many of you feel beautiful and graceful and refined and you know, perfect every moment of your life when you're doing the dishes or doing your yard work or at work? You know, the reality is that women work and they work hard, and that was certainly true in the 19th century. Women were doing unpaid labor in the home, on farms in their households, or they might be going out to work for wages as domestic servants or factory workers. But that attire is light years away from the ball gown look. This is a working woman's look. And I should say, working woman implies that, you know, there's two different subsets of women. The same woman who wore this dress might also wear the ball gown dress. This is what she wore for the facet of life that required her to, you know, put her shoulder to the wheel and get work done. And these types of garments don't survive because they weren't considered special in the day. This is an everyday garment. They weren't considered especially beautiful. They tended to get a lot of rough wear. So this one here is from the 1860s, and this was worn on a farm. You can see all the holes in the fabric. It's had a lot of rough use. It's just a plain cotton fabric. And for work dresses, women often chose cotton prints, small figured prints. One, because the cotton was fairly durable and could be washed easily. Small print like you would garment apart and like rework it, so you like cut out the worn parts and reassemble it in a way where you're salvaging used cloth. And when you have a small pattern, it's much easier to match those patterns than when you've got like a big giant pattern. We have these women styled in their aprons. This is around 1860, so this is hoop skirt era, but this woman is not wearing a hoop skirt, and she may have had dresses and hoops in her wardrobe, but when she's working around the farm, that's just kind of gonna trip her up, so she's not in the full attire. This dress here is from later in the century. This belonged to a woman in Springfield. And this is another work dress. Again, we've got the cotton. We've got the signs of wear, especially if you see under the arms and see how worn that fabric is. And we actually have several bodices belonging to this woman, and all of them display this wear pattern under the arm. And we think that that's where her corset and her arm rubbed against each other, causing that distinctive pattern of wear. Again, though, this was something comfortable, easy to wash, easy to move around in, and something that would have been worn for work. We'll move down the row here. So we have two very different seeming wedding dresses that we're looking at. And I gave it away. I was going to say, what do these have in common? They're both wedding dresses. So this is a white wedding gown from 1854. It belonged to a woman named Carolyn Sutherland. And right next to it is a dark blue wedding dress from the year 1880 that belonged to a woman named Bertha Hippen. And so in the 19th century, there's a wide variety of what women wore for wedding dresses. When Queen Victoria got married in 1840, helped to make the fashion for white dresses popular. And so this cream dress kind of reflects this growing popular trend. Cream dresses are very impractical, to say the least. It's very hard to maintain a white dress in the 19th century. And so the white dresses tended to be worn by the more affluent brides who could afford a dress that was either single use, worn once, or a dress that she might reuse at some point as a ball gown down the road, but it's much more likely to get stained and have a shorter life cycle. And indeed, we know that Carolyn Sutherland did come from an affluent family. Bertha Hippen's dress is characteristic of a choice that many 19th century brides made to get married in their best dress. And so this is a dress that would have been a very nice dress that served for a special occasion as a wedding. But afterwards, she didn't pack it away in tissue paper and put it away as a family heirloom. She kept it in her wardrobe, and she probably wore it to church. And the next year, she might have updated it. She might have added a little detail with or changed the buttons out, or kind of freshened it to keep it a nice dress that was in circulation in her wardrobe. And it wasn't until the 20th century that the convention for wedding dresses being white really took hold in American culture. And now at the 21st century, we're kind of a little bit back to, you know, let's incorporate some more colors. Maybe they don't all have to be white. So again, things move in cycles. So now we're in front of a reproduction of a day dress that belonged to Lucy Mcwhorter. And Lucy was the wife of Frank Mcwhorter, also known as Free Frank, into slavery in 1817. After having worked for several years, he had earned enough money to purchase freedom for one of his family members. And at that point, he chose to purchase freedom for Lucy because she was the mother of his children, and he wanted any future children born to her to be born free. And this is a time he purchased her freedom in 1817. This is a time when the cotton economy is really getting going in the United States. And they were enslaved in Kentucky. At that point, the slave market is sort of shifting south to the cotton plantations, and enslaved people in upper South states like Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina were in real danger of being sold south to work in cotton plantations. So this must have been at the forefront of Mr. Mcwhorter's mind when he chose to purchase the freedom of his wife and future children. And indeed, Mr. Mcwhorter worked and accumulated enough money so that over the course of his lifetime, he was able to free 16 of his family members, including himself. And the family journeyed to Pike County, Illinois, where they established the settlement of New Philadelphia. And this is where Lucy Mcwhorter lived out the rest of her life. So the dress we have here is a reproduction from a photo that dates to the late 1850s. And so the dress really speaks to the evolution in Lucy's lifetime. So as a young enslaved woman, Lucy's agency in her dress would have come from the way that she combined ensembles, you know, what kind of bodice she paired with what kind of dress. If she had received clothing from the lady of the house, what she paired that with in her own wardrobe. As a free woman living in Illinois, she had a different kind of agency or of choosing make my own clothes, or do I hire a seamstress? What kind of fabric do I want to wear? This is under her control now. And how do I want to present myself? And so the wonderful thing about Lucy's photograph is that she is dressed very conventionally for mid-19th century older, and she would have been in her 80s when that photo was taken. And elderly women of that time were advised to dress in kind of somber, muted colors. They often wore looser fitting tops that would accommodate either kind of a relaxed corset or foregoing a corset altogether in older age. And even her day cap here is kind of a nice little sort of dressy touch for older women. And we reproduced this dress because sadly very few items of African-American clothing survive from the 19th century. And in part, this is because of a sort of ingrained collecting bias in museums. Museums have a history of being founded by and funded by white people, and so there's sort of an inherent bias of white people coming to donate their items and white stories being told, and often African-American clothing got overlooked and not preserved. So we are hoping to correct this pattern and build up our holdings of African-American items in our collection and items belonging to people of color so we can better tell the stories that represent the entirety of Illinois' people.
So we have some questions on this one. How much of the bias correlates to income and class, and how much is specific to race?
You know, the income and class is certainly part of it, and that goes back to what I said at the beginning about the ball gowns tending to survive. Also, wedding dresses survive, as well as the to the exclusion of the working dresses, the everyday dresses. So I would say both, and it's hard to know where one begins and one ends. And there's also a reality of in post-Reconstruction America, African Americans and people of color were placed at an economic disadvantage by Jim Crow laws. So it's all sort of a cycle that feeds together. And certainly as we aim to get more inclusive in the museum, we also want to broaden our scope to include objects of everyday life and, you know, all classes, not just elite people, shiny, very expensive. So we're gonna swing around here. This is one of my favorite garments. This is the wrapper. And so this is the 19th century equivalent of the housecoat or the soft pants of today. This is what you wear in the house when you don't feel like getting dressed and you're not expecting any company. So this is this very sturdy twilled cotton ensemble. You see it's got buttons down the front. This was a great choice for nursing mothers too. This is what you would wear when you got up in the morning to go to breakfast, when you're working around the house, before you had company. What's funny about this is that some of them were structured in a way where it's clear you were expected to wear underpinnings. This is the case of this one. You see in the back. This is meant to accommodate a little like back bustle cage here. So I don't see the point in putting on your corset and your bustle cage if you're just going to put on a loose robe. I would rather just, you know, be free underneath, but that's the 19th century for you. And next to it is, again, one of my favorite dresses just because it's rare in terms of museum survivals. This is a completely handmade Lindsay Woolsey dress. So the woman who made this dress, who lived in Southern Illinois, made the flax, wove it, spun it, dyed it, wove the fabric, and then created this dress. And so this is a dress that she would have created and used on her farm. And you can just kind of see looking at it, she wasn't the world's best seamstress, and I'm not judging her because I can't sew a stitch, but in terms of construction, like this didn't quite line up, and she had her stripes aligned here, but they kind of go wonky. We're used to our clothes being made to certain specifications, you know, and it's always like finished just right. Like in the 19th century, your quality of clothing depended on how well you could sew. And, you know, if you weren't a super professional seamstress, then, you know, you got details like this that you just lived with. And she probably would have had a collar over that, but I liked so much that it was a little askew that I left it on full view. She did give herself pockets though, which I absolutely love. Okay, on to the kiddos. We're kind of going to take a journey through the life cycle of a woman, starting on this back wall and going along, starting with the infant dress and the toddler dress. So infants until about the age of 9 months to a year were dressed in very long clothes. And sometimes one sees them and we think like, oh, christening gown. And it actually wasn't. Babies just wore long dresses. They thought it was healthy to fold the bottom of the gown around the little baby's feet to keep it warm. Once a child became mobile and learned to walk, they would be put in a shorter dress so their little legs could move around freely and they could, you know, exercise their mobility. Both of these are unisex. So in the 19th century, people thought it was more important to distinguish small children from adults than boys from girls. So all children up until the ages of about 3 to 7 were just sort of like gender neutral children, all in dresses. They typically were in white, which today is the least practical color to put on a child. Back then it was the most practical. All the scrubbed right off of them. and be ready. So clothes were dyed or of more delicate fabrics just couldn't handle the cleaning that a small child's clothing required. Okay, so by the time you hit 3 to 7 years old, you see gender differences start to emerge in children. Little girls are in dresses, typically back closing, where little boys are in these little suits. They're both short, so girls are in relatively short skirts and boys are in relatively short pants. And for both genders, the length of their hems will lengthen as they get older. By around the age of 9 or 10, clothing starts to mimic that of adults. So this is this wonderful little bustle dress for a little girl who would be dressed probably pretty close to her mother at this point, except for her skirt is still shorter. When girls reached maturity around age 14 or 15, their skirts would finally hit the floor, their hair would be pinned up, and this would be a sign that they were sort of ready for the dating market and considered mature. Moving on to the maternity dresses. Again, things that don't typically survive in museum collections. Maternity clothes weren't so much of a thing. You didn't have specific clothes that you wore during pregnancy and no time. But when existing, modify it to a pregnancy. And this one, I'm putting her right about here. And you can see this drawstring that was built into the garment to go over this woman's belly. And so maternity clothing typically was altered to accommodate a pregnancy, and after a pregnancy, it might be altered back or turned into children's clothing or otherwise reused. Sadly, in the case of both of these women, they both died in childbirth. This woman in 1855 and this woman in 1892. And I wonder if this is part of the reason that these clothes survive for us today, is because the woman who wore them didn't live to have the chance to alter them or remake them. They kind of got packed away and eventually found their way to the museum. Going on here, we have the older lady and the younger lady together to show the contrast. There are some similarities between the two. They're both wearing, you know, kind of these subtle stripes. The older lady is in this muted brown. And this, again, like we talked about with Lucy Mcwhorter, was a convention for middle-class women of a certain age. They were expected to dress in sort of quiet, muted colors and low-key prints. Her top
What would be that certain age?
Oh, you know what? It was young in the 19th century. Once you married, your days of wearing, you know, vibrant colors are on the decline, and probably by the time you hit about 30, you should, and then, like, you know, once you become in your golden years, shall we say, then you can give up the corset if you want to, because you've lived long enough to earn the right to be comfortable. So oftentimes you see a very loose top or this wonderful little cape here, which sort of, you know, covers things on top. Contrasted with, this is a young woman's dress, probably an unmarried woman's dress. And the wide neckline is characteristic of young women, as is this beautiful, vibrant color. And one of the etiquette manuals of the time said that a certain gaiety and brightness of attire is as suitable for youth as sober colors and quiet styles are for the more advanced in life. And then we're going to wind up with the mourning and burial dresses. So this is a mourning dress that was worn by Clara Mason Huffaker when her father died in 1894. So mourning in the 19th century was an elaborate ritual. The caveat is the degree to which people practice mourning depended on a whole variety of factors, including what you could afford, what your inclination was, how close you were to the deceased. If you wanted to go all in and just mourn to the nth degree, a widow was, the ideal was that a woman would mourn mourn a husband for between 6 months to a year of deep mourning, all black, no jewelry, nothing. Another 6 months to a year of white at the collars and cuffs and jet beads, and then another 6 months of half mourning, which was grays and lavenders. So if you really wanted to mourn, you could mourn for 2.5 years. Of course, men had very different expectations. A man whose wife died would be perhaps wearing a black hatband or an armband for 3 to 6 months. He, as a person who had to earn a living, was not expected to be encumbered by the whole mourning get-up. And also, if he had small children, it was sort of expected that he needed another lady in his household to care for his children and to manage the house. And so men sort of had a shorter window of remarrying. So this is a fairly elaborate dress, especially for a parent. Etiquette at the time suggested a 6-month mourning period when a parent passed away. And then the final garment is on loan to us from the Wisconsin Historical Society. And this is a mass-produced burial dress that was meant for a young girl that dates to about the year 1900. So prior to the Civil War, death took place in the home. People didn't generally go to hospitals when they were ill. They were cared for at home. When they passed on, their bodies were tended to by their loved ones in the home. The funerals took place in the parlor. And at that point, people were dressed for death either in night clothes, which symbolized the idea that death was a long sleep, dress as a after the Civil War, the process of death started to move out of the house, and now you have the rise of the funeral parlor. So the deceased would be taken to a funeral parlor and cared for by an undertaker, and you could also purchase burial clothing from an undertaker, and so this is what this represents here. So this is a mass-produced garment. What you see here is the finished portion, and this is the portion that would be visible in a casket. The rest of it is all kind of rough seams and unfinished edges and papery lining, because that would not be visible to the public. So now we have sped through all of it, and I'm sorry, I know I talked too long, but we are going to zip over to a clip to show you our collection center and talk about some of the garments that didn't make the cut to be in the show, and then we will wind up with some more questions. So here we are at the Research and Collection Center on Ash Street, and we are in the History and Art range, and more specifically we're in the part of the range we call the lab, and this is the textile storage facility for the Illinois State Museum. So this is where we store not only our vast collection of quilts, but also our extensive collection of historic costumes. And as we walk down the aisle, all the tan-colored boxes are quilts. On top of the range up there are long boxes that hold historic garments. So as you can see, we've got quite a collection. And we're coming around to the work area of the lab. So the Illinois State Museum absorbed the historic costume collections of both Illinois State University and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign's Home Economics Department. So all the boxes that you see on this aisle and on these racks there and along the top are all historic garments. And until the Fashioning Illinois exhibition, almost none of them have been exhibited to the public. So there's treasure troves of clothing for future displays here. And so here we are at the work table. This is a place where we can spread things out, to examine them, to accession them, and catalog them. Right now, I wanted to show you some examples of garments that did not make it into the Fashioning Illinois exhibition. We have all these wonderful clothes, and I wanted to show them all, but in the end there just wasn't space, and so decisions had to be made about which garment highlighted which particular aspect of the story that we wanted to tell, and some of them sadly did not make the cut. So I'm ready to dive in. Again, my hands are clean. Sometimes when working with garments, gloves are not advised because when you're working with something you need dexterity and to be able to have your tactile sensation. So my hands are freshly washed. I'm gonna dive in here, and anyone who's a little bit of a historic costume nerd, when faced with big garment boxes of old clothes, there's a little bit of a Christmas morning feel. You take off the lid and you don't know what you're gonna find. So I hope you're feeling that excitement right now. I know I certainly do every time I pull down one of these boxes. So this first box here has a, what I would consider a wrapper. And this probably dates from about the 1850s, I would say. And this almost made the cut because I believe that this was probably used as a maternity garment. You can see that there's a drawstring, and this may well have been added at some point in the garment's life to accommodate a pregnancy. So it might have started life as kind of a wrapper, you know, for a non-pregnant woman, and when that woman got pregnant, she added the drawstring to accommodate her growing belly. And this is very typical of what you see with maternity clothing. You didn't have maternity clothing ready-made. Women typically altered the clothing that they had to accommodate their pregnancies. So that's just a wonderful detail. Some of the construction is wonderful too. You can see inside that it's lined with this calico cotton, and this is kind of a characteristic pattern of an earlier time. This is maybe like an 1830s or an 1840s pattern here. And so what might have happened is this might either be remnants of the construction of a dress from 20 years ago, or it might be the leftovers from a dress that got worn out and someone salvaged the fabric and incorporated it into the lining of this wrapper here. Sadly, this dress did not make the cut because we don't have any history or provenance on this item other than it came from, let's see, this one came from the University of Illinois, but we don't know who wore it. The two maternity garments that did make it into the exhibit, we know exactly who wore them and when their children were born, and so having that personal narrative behind them made them more powerful objects, and put this one on the cutting block, sadly, but I'm glad I got a chance to show it to a wider audience during this, this talk we're giving. So we'll move on to the next one. And this dress was a contender for our 1860s garment. It's this wonderful, screaming green, vibrant dress, and actually in the 19th century this level of green was often achieved through the use of arsenic to make a chemical dye that produced this green color. So this might well have been a very poisonous dress. It's certainly eye-catching. It fits with kind of a slightly post-Civil War time, maybe 1866 or 67 or so. We did not select this one because it has been on display. It was in our Civil War quilt exhibit from about 5 or 6 years ago, and so because this dress already had its moment in the sun, we decided to give another dress a chance in this exhibition. So this is another runner-up to be in the exhibit. And what do we have here? Oh, this looks like it. This is fun. This is its little bum piece. This is something that would be sewn or pinned or buttoned to the back of the dress. This is just when we're starting to move from the hoop skirt era and dresses are making their way to the back to the bustle era, so a little bit more like emphasis behind is what's going on here. moving right along. I remember this dress. So this dress is an awesome version of an 1850s dress. And so you might remember from an earlier talk I gave that fashion tends to kind of go through these alternating decades where they're a little bit more conservative and restrained one decade, and then they get a little bit more like, you know, vibrant and ostentatious one decade, and switching back and forth. So the 1850s was definitely a vibrant decade. There was a lot of use of color and pattern and trim, and so this, you know, this mix of this wonderful silk with a zigzag band, with a striped band, and all the decorative fringe is very characteristic of the 1850s. This one is wonderful, and I'll come around to the top. This one is wonderful, and I love it when this happens. This still has its attached undersleeves on it. So the undersleeves were, they were a lovely little touch. You can see this beautiful embroidery on the cuff, but they were also very practical. This is what you wear around your wrists, and your wrists are a grimy part of your body that tends to, you know, soil your garments. And so this undersleeve here, and we'll very gently look inside here. This is, you can see how it's just very lightly basted onto the garment. And so this is something that would be snipped off, and this undersleeve would be laundered, and then it would be basted in again when it was time to wear. And this woman doubtlessly had several pairs of undersleeves like that she would rotate through the wash and through wearing. And so for this to survive with the garment is just wonderful. Open up the bodice just to get a little look inside, lined with kind of a plain brown, it looks like linen. And you can see the wonderful cartridge pleat details here that gave it that full skirt. Looks like there's been some alteration here. Perhaps the skirt was lengthened at the top. These are later hooks that were added. And this would have helped to attach the top to the skirt to kind of make one smooth looking garment. And so this lovely dress was a strong contender. It did not make the cut because to represent the 1850s, we chose a dress that belonged to Mary Lincoln's sister. So that's our claim to fame, or fame adjacent. We don't have any dresses that belong to famous women in the exhibition, but we have Mary Lincoln's sister's dress. And moreover, that dress is sort of an olive green with these lavender stripes. And purple was a new discovery. This was a synthetic dye that had been discovered in 1856 by a chemist who was trying to synthesize quinine to treat malaria. He didn't achieve quinine, but he achieved purple, and it became a fashion craze in the 1850s. And so we wanted that represented in the show, and so this one had to stay in the box here. And then this very last one is one of the most stunning dresses that we have in this collection, and if there was any way to put it on display, I absolutely would. This dress dates from the 1890s. And it has some of the most stunning embroidery I have ever seen on a garment. This very lovely Art Nouveau with these naturalistic blooms and this amazing robin egg blue color. It's really just an incredible garment. Sadly, as you can see right here, it's also in terrible, terrible shape. So as badly as I want to display it, it is simply just too fragile to put on display. So again, it lives here safely in storage, wrapped up with acid-free tissue paper. But I'm so glad that we have the opportunity to do this so people can see it, because I think this was a dress that was created to be seen and admired. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. We're going to hop back over to me live in the gallery, and at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions. Okay, here I am, live, different clothes. If anyone has any questions, Kate will read them to me, and I will do my best to answer.
Here's one. When does the term cartridge come into use?
Oh boy, when does the term cartridge pleats come into use? I don't know the answer to that. I am more of an academic appreciator of clothing rather than a sewer of garments, and so it's a little too deep for me. I know that cartridge pleats are being used in the 1840s through the 1860s, but I don't know the history of the term.
The green dress, would there still be any arsenic left in it?
Also an interesting question that I do not know the answer to. I know the Metropolitan Museum of Art had this awesome exhibit on clothing and how it poisons people. So that answer is discernible. They probably know the answer to that, but I'm gonna look that up.
Given the 6-month periods of clothing choices in mourning, how many of each 6-month period dresses would a woman have owned?
Boy, that is an excellent question. I know that some women had clothing made specifically, like take existing clothing that you have and dye it black. And keeping in mind women didn't have all that many items of clothing to begin with, I would say, again, depending on your level of affluence, if you were well off, maybe you had a rotation of 5 or 6. If you were less well off, maybe you had, 2 that you cycled through.
At what point were pockets commonly incorporated into dresses?
So that seems to have started around the 1850s and the 1860s. Before then, you would have a pocket that you could tie on around your waist, and there would be a slit in the front of your garment, and you could put your hand through that slit and into this pocket. We'll actually show it during our underpinnings talk if you want to tune in for that. But by the 1850s and 1860s, just in my personal going through a lot of these garments, I started to notice a lot of pockets around that point. And what's really fun is that every so often you will find a crumpled up hanky still in the pocket of the dress.
Do you believe that the patterns for dresses, historic dresses that are made now, are similar to how they would have been made back in the day?
My sense is simplified and streamlined a little bit. In general, broadly speaking, the average 19th century woman would have had much more advanced sewing skills than the average 21st century woman. Women were brought up from, very tiny age, 4 or 5, all women sewing. And so I think the level of skill and, just the stitches and techniques that they were familiar with was probably in advance of where we're at in general. That's not to say that, an advanced sewer of the 21st century couldn't tackle a 19th century project, but so my sense is that they're simplified somewhat, but there are reenactors and historic clothing specialists who are very authentic and use authentic patterns and can mimic all the different techniques, but if you're just going to buy one off the internet, I would say it's probably a little bit simplified from what it would have been in the 19th century.
Someone asked, what causes the deterioration of dresses like the one shown last in the video?
The silk shattered. So silk was often imported from Europe and China, or even from within the United States. It's manufactured in one part of the country and shipped somewhere else. And for whatever reason, it was packed in a chemical for preservation in the short term that long-term leads to the degradation. So with old silk, you often see, it's called shattering. It's just whatever chemical it was packed in for shipping ultimately breaks down the fibers and turns it kind of stringy like that.
Some people are asking a little bit about about you and your background and how you came to work here, etc. So you want to explain a little bit about
who I am and who does this woman think she is talking about these clothes, which is a completely fair question. Yes, so I hold a bachelor's degree in history and English from Illinois Wesleyan University, and then I hold a master's degree in early American culture from the Winterthur program, which was through the University of Delaware. And so that was a 2-year program that was focused on early American material culture. So I received training in metals and furniture and paintings and ceramics and textiles, which came in handy at this point. Although, looking back, I wish I had paid attention more 20 years ago. So a lot of what I've learned about historic garments has been actually by working with the collection and studying on the job.
Thanks all. We really appreciate all of you sticking around and hanging out with us, and we hope that you can come to next month's event on making cloth and clothing.